Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome back to another episode of the Historians Lounge here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Garcia. Maybe you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us is another returning Wandering Scribe alumni. Now, this guest, like many others, needs no introduction. She is an incredible historian, incredible educator. She has done so much. She has researched so much history, specifically about the Marines and their battles, as well as some lesser known aspects about the Marine Corps, which is always exciting. And in today's episode, viewers and listeners, my guest and I will be examining two pinnacle battles in the entire history of the Marine Corps: the Battle of Belleau in World War I and the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War. And I can think of no better guest to be here on the show with me than my good friend, fellow historian, and fellow child of a Marine, Lynne Marx. Lynne, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Awesome, Lynne. So excited to have you back here on the show. Now, before we begin and dive into today's topic, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners a little life update of what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show?
Since the last time I've been on the show, I've had 3 articles accepted, and one of them I can show you. And then and then a journal called In Command.
Yes.
Yes. And it's called Operation Shoestring, and the Candy Marines at the Battle of Guadalcanal. So
nice. Awesome, Lynne. Congratulations.
Thank you. And then there's another article that went into that called Double Birds, which focuses on the air wing aspect of the Guadalcanal operation with the Marines. And then I have coming out in the summer, The Echoes of Belleau. And yeah. And then I'm working on 2 articles. One's going to be specifically about the Battle of Belleau and how it influenced the other battles in World War II, including up to Chosin Reservoir. And then I'm going to focus on General Oliver Prince Smith, or O.P. Smith, the Marine general who was at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. And he also was at Belleau and the influence that it had on him. So
nice. All right.
What I'm doing. So yeah, I'm excited about it. It's fun.
That's amazing, Lynne. That is amazing. And I'm so excited we get a chance to talk about these 2 really important battles in not just military history, but also the history of the Marine Corps, which, as I said in the beginning, viewers and listeners, both Lynne and I are children of Marines. So this is very, very important. And honestly, these 2 battles, in my opinion, and from what I've seen, they don't get a lot of recognition. When people think about the Marines, they only think about, World War II. And you know what? Absolutely should, because the Marines really did cement their legacy in World War II. But these battles are equally important for very, very important reasons. So, Lynne, as a little overview, what can you tell us about the Battle of Belleau in World War I, as well as the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War?
Okay, the Battle of Belleau was pretty much, at least in World War I, the first Marine Corps operation. There were some Army guys around, but it was a Marine-driven operation, and so that was really important. And it also cemented them as a land force, so to speak, because the Marine Corps was, before that, more recognized as sea soldiers. They're the police officers of the ships, kind of thing. And so World War I, this was their actual first chance that people actually saw that they were just sea soldiers, as they called themselves. They were called. They became an amphibious force that worked on land and sea. And so this battle also would influence the Marine Corps for many, many, many long years, including up to the Chosin Reservoir and past it. Chosin Reservoir was also very important because it proved to people that amphibious operations could still be done. I know you don't hear people saying that, but it did prove that. And very unusual conditions and very tough conditions that shouldn't have led up to happen. And it also showed the Marine Corps' adaptability. Both of the battles actually did. How they were able to take what they had learned, and like for the Battle of Belleau, per se, they kind of got thrown into a meat mixer, meat grinder, so to speak, and they had to learn quickly how to respond because what they had been trained on didn't necessarily reflect what shit was going on in the battle. So they had to adapt very rapidly, and there was a high attrition rate because of learning the adaptability. Well, Chosin Reservoir, they were thrown into this. They were part of X Corps, which was commanded by General Edwin Allman, and he was in charge of it was Army infantry, and then there's a Marine Corps division. And so they were both. And Oliver P. Smith was the commander of the 1st Marine Division. And his decisions and everything really made the Battle of Belleau happen. Have the success that the Marines did, the escape that they did, and everything moving forward. That was all related to what he had learned from before and what he did. And a lot of the guys he did have underneath him had been veterans of World War II. In the island campaigns. So it all kind of intertwines from, all the way from back to the Battle of Belleau all the way through up to, Chosin Reservoir for sure, when it comes to famous operations development and all that kind of all just springs from that area.
Nice. All right. So let's actually start with the Battle of Belleau as like our focal point. Now, what were the key contributions of the Marines during the Battle of Belleau in World War I, and how did these contributions impact the overall outcome of the battle? Because as many people do not know, the Battle of Belleau is also how the Marines got their moniker nickname Devil Dogs.
Right. First off, the Devil Dog, there's never been any evidence that any historical evidence to prove this. It's just a Marine legend, let's say. But it does. The German it said it meant devil dog, and so they were very proud of that. The Germans saw these guys running and charging in ways that they thought they shouldn't, because they were just kind of like, gung ho. I don't want to say gung ho. Gung ho makes me sound like they're like cocky, but they weren't that. They were just, they knew they had to fight for the brother next to each other, and they were going to charge and do their job. They were Marines. That was their assignment. They're going to do their assignment, and that's what they did. And this was important, they saw on the way there, even they saw the ravages of war happening. They saw not Japanese, sorry. They saw the Germans, the Parisians, the French people walking, back from battles and stuff like that. And they kind of saw some of the French really downtrodden, the soldiers, that is. And then they saw the people that were just kind of like, old people and young people and babies and everything going through the streets, leaving Paris and everything, just to get away from the Germans and type of thing. So they saw this really broken morale appeared to them, what they saw and everything. And that helped drive them, because they thought what they were doing was right and all. And so they kept going. And like I said, being part of the Corps, they had this spirit de Corps that as a Marine kid, about. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a big, huge element. And another thing in that battle that's really important is General John Archer Lejeune, who was an observer of that battle. And he became a Marine Corps commandant between World War I and World War II. And so again, it all goes back to Belleau and everything and how they were fighting. And when they first started fighting, they would do the traditional standing up in roles, and kind of charging in. And then eventually they quit doing that, and they started doing more like an Indian style war, as they would call it, where they'd be, kind of getting low and sneaking in and kind of come in and fight, mm-hmm. those type of tactics. And that's where the gung ho idea came from. People would think of that. So they kept going, even though they might be slaughtered. Someone's falling down in front of them, they kept going. They kept charging until they did what they could. And so there was like I said, a huge attrition rate really for that battle, because it took them a while to learn, as they learned how to fight with them and stuff. And it took a while, for them to go from this little pack of woods that was very dense, had a giant rock boulders and craters, and it was hard to see. So, they would get separated from each other at times and not know who's who. And all that stuff. And then they also had to fight with Germans that were actually tied to trees, trespassing, which impacted how they would also have to fight. So they literally would have to go in and knock out the German guns to take the territory. And they kept doing it a little bit by little bit. So it was inch by inch by inch. So, yeah.
Nice. Interesting. Now, on this topic, how did the tactics employed by the Marines at Belleau differ from those used by the Army during World War One? Because, again, the thing that a lot of people do not know about the Marines during this time is that there was a discussion of, well, are we going to integrate the Marines just fully into the Army? We'll just have an Army,
right.
a Navy, and an Air Force. Like, what do we do with the Marines? So this battle really did save the Marines' position in military history.
Right. And really, there wasn't a Air Force at that time. There was an Army Air Corps and a Navy, a budging Navy and Marine Air Wings also at that time. We actually had Marines over there flying, by the way, just so you know. It's kind of really cool. But this battle, just the way they did stuff, Pershing was he was a commandant of all the American Expeditionary Forces, but he was very old school in way he wanted them to fight and stuff like that. So his ideas would be very much what the Army would do, like the lining up, battle one at a time, the lines kind of into battle and stuff. And I think that might have changed too, because for them eventually, but the sad thing is we actually had people come over before we went to war and observe what was going on over there. And there was a disconnect with what was actually going on and how they were fighting the war. And so that kind of showed up in that. And so the Marines literally had to learn on the fly how to do things. And the Army, they would go in the battle, maybe next to the French or whatever. But this was more basically, like I said, a truly Marine Corps oriented battle where they made the decisions and made how they'd fight and all that. Where for other battles, they'd have to list others, whatever. So this was a big battle for them in that way.
Absolutely. And I think it's also really interesting how I've seen a lot of videos, a lot of documentaries, how battles that the Marines are in, they've also earned like some either nicknames or it adds further to their lore. And correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, but there's always been stories of like enemy combatants who have fought the Marines throughout, World War I to present, who have said that to join the Marines, you would have to be a dangerous and deranged killer, which adds to the lore of the Marines and their prowess as a fighting force. Now,
that affected the Chosin Reservoir campaign. The Chinese Communist forces, because of the Marines' reputation, they wanted to fight them. They're the ones they wanted to fight. They were the number one troops in their eyes, and because they're the number one troops, that's who they wanted to fight. They didn't think of the soldiers as the tough ones, the Army guys. They wanted to prove their mettle. They had to fight against Marines, and that was part of the Chinese Communist Forces campaign ideas in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. So again, that lore of them being, and that's something I think I saw a few times in my research. The Germans are saying these guys are crazy. These guys are, they'll just keep on going, and not expecting that to be the case. And there's, because they were a younger force, they haven't been around as long as a nation, and Americans were kind of already looked down on type of thing. So they really had a lot to prove as Marines, because even in the U.S. military world, Marines were kind of looked down on, by the Army, by the Navy, even though they had been part of our culture since our nation's founding, pretty much. It's
that is true. And so I'm very curious, Lynn, in what ways did the experiences of Belleau Woods, shape the identity of the Marines and their ethos for future conflicts, including World War II and Korea? Because a lot of World War I Marine veterans did partake in World War II, and probably one of the most famous Marines, which I don't know, correct if I'm wrong, I don't know, he was in World War I, probably the most famous Marine that any soldier at Camp Pendleton or another Marine Corps base or any Marine Corps bases knows of, Chesty Puller, who is arguably one of the most iconic Marines in military history.
Yes, and he, like you said, he's been in, he was part of the staff and stuff like that. The guys who were part of Belleau Wood or in France during that time period who actually did observing and stuff like that. It affected them um, very much. Starting with the Marine General John Lejeune became the Marine Commandant. Because of what he saw at this battle, he was determined that his Marines would never, ever not be prepared again. This was not going to happen. They're not going to have this huge learning curve. We're going to be up to date on all this stuff. And so he made sure education was very important part of the Corps. He wanted his guys from the grunts all the way up, education, stay on top of the new techniques, new stuff. And that was something that he really focused on. He also focused on the Marine Corps become amphibious force because they didn't want to be another army. They didn't. I mean, they saw people looking at us as another army, especially after Belleau Wood. Even though we weren't there as an army, that's what they thought of us because of the land battle. And then you also had they weren't necessarily being needed against ships anymore because the ships dynamics have changed and everything. They were there to enforce rules, make sure people weren't, doing mutiny and all that stuff. So that also was like a dividing point. And so the Belleau Wood kind of just pushed this need for them to have their special own definition of who they were. They had to have their own definition. So they worked on becoming amphibious force as a part of their identity. And that's what you're seeing in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. You saw that in the Pacific Theater all the way through. You've even seen it now, like we're kind of returning back to our amphibious roots right now as a core. If you pay attention to any of their doctrine or any of that, you will see that they kind of work in that way because the battles are back out in the Pacific area again. I know there's a war kind of going on right now in the Middle East, but again, the amphibious idea is very much a Marine Corps concept, and it's their identity, and it all comes down from the Battle of Belleau Wood and him going, okay, we need to have our own identity, we have our own purpose, because they had like identity crisis after World War I, because like I said, the army didn't want them to be another fighting force. They didn't want to be an land only army. They had to figure out where they would belong, and so they kind of carved out this niche for themselves through it all and everything, and that's exactly what they did, and they worked on it during that time period from Belleau Wood all the way. Even now, you can still see Marines training for this all the time. They have operations, exercises all over the place, all over the world, trying to prepare for it. So Belleau Wood did that. That was one of the big things it did. It also made them popular with the people in America because for the first time, the Marines got press, and this is kind of funny too because the commander of the army, expeditionary forces, Pershing, he didn't want any military names being not said in any of the news stories or whatever. And because of that, the Marines were the only ones where everyone knew there was Marines were only there. So if they say Marines, they knew who they were. And so when there was an article that went out that was not vetted like normal to the same degree, the Marines got lots of glory. And of course, that helped divide the Army and the Marines. Because the Army was mad about the Marines getting all this glory, and the Marines didn't actually ask for this glory. They had done anything wrong, but because this article came out saying, "Hey, they did all this stuff." The guy was injured. The person who wrote it, and I'm trying to remember his name is. I don't remember his name right now, but he anyhow he was injured, and he actually got wounded in the eye. This newspaper reporter did. And so they thought he was going to die. And so they kind of pushed his stuff in. And because of that, just saying Marines was just enough for people to know, hey, that is the 1st Marine Division. That's, the 4th and 5th Marines. That's who's there. We know that because the Army only read what? Only the 2 divisions. And not division, sorry. The 2 brigades. Actually, that's not even right either. Anyhow, 4th and 5th regiments became the Marine Brigade, which was part of the 2nd American Expeditionary Force. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So they're like, because the Marines didn't really have anything bigger than regiments at that point type of thing. So brigade. And so that's kind of how, by doing all that, he basically gave the Marines glory because everyone knew who they were. They were the 4th and 5th Marines.
Absolutely.
And so again, that helped, some of the division between some of the rivalry that you actually hear and see to this day. And some people that are soldiers, I know this for a fact, are very hateful of the Marines. They love them because they're Americans, but they don't love them because of the Marines. If that makes sense. It's kind of like, oh, it's you're a Marine, where instead of, oh, you're a fellow American soldier. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the
that
thing.
love-hate relationship between the different branches it's always going to be there. And
Right.
kind of going back earlier, can you explain, especially for our viewers and listeners, the significance of the phrase, I'm probably going to butcher this, viewers and listeners, the German phrase Tufelhuden in the context to the Marines' legacy, particularly stemming from their actions at Belleau Wood,
Right.
because
Right.
apparently from the lore, from there's not a lot of strong research, that is what the translation would be for Anklinite version of devil dogs, but what some would argue to be, hellhounds or hounds of hell.
Right. Right. Yes. It's yeah. For translation, I think I've seen this a few times. It's like devil wolf or something like that. It's not quite devil
Yes.
dog. Hellhound is a good way to say it. And so the Marines were very glad to take that title because it meant they were fighters and they, were special and they stuck out. And so they're like, yeah, we're going to call that. And even today, they are very much devil dogs. And it's kind of neat because that devil dog moniker also, um, the Marine Air Wing, they were actually called devil birds at one time by people because of the way they were fighting, the close air support that they provide. So it kind of goes into, related into that. And then you have your corpsmen, which they call devil dogs. So that devil thing right there that's what they're proud of, and even that's why they have a dog for a mascot, named
Yep.
Justin because of
Oh,
that
yes.
title,
I love it.
So yeah, it was a Marine mystique, if you want to call it, that's just passed down from generation to generation to generation about the title, the story about the Marines calling them that. Again, like I said, there's nothing, we can't find any evidence other than the myth part. So far, my research, anyhow, I haven't. I would love to find it. It'd be cool if I could. But it is their identity. That's who they are. If you ask a Marine, they're a devil dog and they wear it proudly. And it
Absolutely,
separates
very,
them.
very true. And as we jump forward now to the Korean War, definitely the devil dog moniker, I mean, was already solidified in World War II, but definitely reinforced
Right.
in the Korean War.
Right.
Now, specifically looking at the Chosin Reservoir conflict, Lynn, what are the central challenges faced by the Marines at that battle? And how did their training and principles help them overcome these obstacles? Because again, from World War I, Belleau Woods, and then to World War II, and then to the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War.
Right.
I mean, World War II in Korea, it's only like a few years difference. So how did
Yes,
things change
exactly.
for the Marines at that battle?
One thing that was helpful for this battle that they didn't really have with Belleau Wood was they had more of a combat experience force, for starters. Um, a lot of the World War II veterans were gone, but when they decided that that they were going to have, they needed to act in Korea, then they brought back a lot of these guys who were retired as the reserves or whatever, and they brought them in. So they were able to pull together forces that they wouldn't be able to do before. And that's part of the reason why the landing Inchon, which is they kind of run into each other, these two campaigns happened because they had to have combat experienced troops, and that also involved the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in the sense that you had combat leaders there who had fought in World War II, had known each other well enough, and uncommon valor was such a part of that battle. I mean, everybody was uncommon valor. It was the conditions and everything. So these guys were able to come in with what they knew from previous experience and use it to fight in this unusual terrain for what they had been in the cold and how it impacted them in the whole 9 yards. And so the experience of that spirit de corps, when they brought these new Marines in that hadn't had the combat experience, they were able to blend them together. And they had people that were in leadership positions that had the combat experience. Now, this is really important. This makes a big difference between the Marine Corps at the Chosin Reservoir and the Army at the Chosin Reservoir. Because the Army, they did not have the same amount of experienced leaders in charge of stuff. They allowed people who had sat at desks during World War II to be the leaders at this battle. And then consequently, when they were getting wiped out, they had leadership voids happening because they didn't have leaderships in all these different positions. So in the Marine Corps, you had to be at least that position you were at least, or like one below it, whatever at the most. I mean, one above it. So they made sure they had people in positions that had experienced that command and leadership position before, or had the training for that position before they led them. So that's a big, huge difference between the two, because we have one that's almost wiped out, and we have one that wasn't. And the Marines Corps was the one that was not wiped out to the same degree. I mean, literally, I don't know if you've heard of Team Faith. He was the 31st RCT Regiment Combat Team. And he was a lot of the leaders, like I said, were people who sat at desks during World War II. So they came into this battle not knowing. And there was a huge push by MacArthur to get to the mountain, to the Yellow River. And so the Marines end up going this way. And O.P. Smith, General O.P. Smith, he did everything he could to keep his Marines together instead of spreading out. So the Army spread their guys out, way out, because there was this rush to get to the river. And he took several steps, to keep his guys together. One of the steps he actually took together was he made sure they had an airstrip that he could bring in supplies and stuff like that for them, or evacuate people when necessary. He ordered his commanders to keep his regiments together. So you had companies staying together, even though they're in these battles, whatever, in these harsh conditions. You had, that was really important. You had, again, that spirit of the Corps that carries them so much that they fight for each other. Automatically, they fight for each other, and they don't want to lose. So even though they end up escaping from there by order, it wasn't a true escape like we're running away. It was like we're battling our way back through. And that's
like a tactical withdrawal.
Yeah. And so they did that. And so they were able to do that. And some of the things they had to deal with in that environment was the cold was extremely cold, to the point where you would have corpsmen putting morphine in their mouths, in the syringes, to warm them up, or in their armpits, because it would freeze. And some of the injuries that happened, the blood would freeze right automatically on you, which saved lives, but it was also dangerous. A lot of people end up with frostbite no matter what they did, because the environment was so harsh in this mountain range. And so they are literally being, pushed aside, like pushed up this mountain together in groups. And there's some battles that happened here and there, different spots in the Chosin Reservoir area, which is part of the Chosin campaign. But they all had to stay together. They kept them together. And that's the biggest thing, I think, is they kept their guys together, fighting as a unit, instead of having them sprawled out in the commanders. And when they did get told to withdraw, they withdraw with their weapons in the whole 9 yards, where the Army had to destroy everything and leave things behind. And the Marines actually helped save the armies as they're coming across the Chosin Reservoir's ice surface to escape, and helped them out. But those are all components of Chosin Reservoir that's completely different. And if you ever hear, the survivors of that battle are called the Frozen Chosin, and that is why the environment was very harsh. I mean, I live in Michigan, and we get really cold, but our cold, it was not the cold that you'd see the Chosin Reservoir at that time of year. And it was unusually cold even for them.
Fascinating. And kind of changing up my next question, would you say, well, actually taking from the next question, but changing it a little bit. So up until this point, the Marines have gone through a severe, I don't want to say rebranding, but definitely they've been better educated from, their time in World War I. They're better prepared, better training, new weapons, staying up to date with the latest in military technology. They've already proved themselves in the Pacific. So would you say that, in a way, being in the Korean War, the Chosin Reservoir was not only, their battle of the bulge, so to speak, because of the frozen environment, but it was kind of almost, in a way, doing almost like a full circle in the sense of how, they started off as a land-based unit during World War I, and by the Chosin Reservoir, I mean, yes, they weren't still an amphibious unit, but they were fighting on land with the army,
the land battles,
just as they did in World War I.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely, Chosin was definitely a land battle within the mountains, and they had to trudge up the mountains and they had to trudge down the mountains, and it was very much land. And their experience, like I said, in Belleau and even in the Pacific, I know impacted them because what the leaders did and how they did things and everything. And it was, Chelsea Puller was there again, another battle of
Yes.
Chelsea Puller. And it's kind of neat to see like some of the commanders and stuff like that were like you said, in World War One, and what they happened down. A lot of them became, either officers or commandants down the corps in that time period, and they're the ones that helped lead stuff. Like some of these guys that were in Europe during World War One, they were some of the guys that were leading things now for the Marines and helping the Marines get what they needed for these battles and everything. And sometimes the Marines get not necessarily the best class stuff because they'll get the Army's leftovers or whatever. And so they try to keep their own stuff, and they try to keep their amphibious stuff ready and everything, so they're ready to do that. And I mean, in Korean War, it worked out well. They had their own stuff, but like Vietnam, the weapons they got the bad weapons, and it impacted them. But yeah, they try to make sure they keep stuff up to date, like you said. Important.
Yes. Very true. Very true. Now,
Did I answer your question?
oh yeah, no, you did. You absolutely did,
Okay.
Lynn. And
Okay.
kind of going back to what you were talking about the beginning, and I'm sure you'll definitely agree that, as a military historian, weather and terrain definitely do play a role in the development of strategies and tactics. So how did the weather and the terrain at the Chosin Reservoir impact the strategies and tactics employed by the Marines at that battle, even going forward to the point, as you gave an example numerous times, of how the Marines saved the Army from pretty much almost getting like wiped out at that battle?
Um, the weather made them. It made it harder. It impacted them big time, where they had to. They were cold like almost all the time. They were getting frostbite. They had to be aware of trying to make sure they kept their socks dry, and because the sweat would freeze and then you end up getting frostbite. So they had to help each other that way. They had to try to keep each other warm, so to speak, by reminding each other, let's change your socks or whatever. And they would not be able to have someone go to sleep, whatever. They sometimes the weather would make their weapons not fire, and so sometimes they'd go to fire somebody and they can't fire because it froze. And so it definitely impacted the battle in that sense, and it made it a harder battle for them to win because there was so much. And this was the first time that the Marines and the Army came across the Chinese Communist forces, because they had just come over. MacArthur had been warned not to go to the Yellow River because the Chinese were saying, if you come to our territory or get close to our territory, we're going to send troops in. So they were basically waiting for opportunity to send their troops in. And the Marines were the ones, and the Army of 31st RCT were the ones who came up and identity with this. And the funny thing is, the Marines had been warning some of the leadership and saying, hey, we've had some incidents where we ran into some Chinese Communist forces that were here, and they disregarded them. And so that made it even harder because they weren't getting the help that they needed or being believed in, even though they had interviewed people, per se, and actually sent up the interviews to the command. People that worked for MacArthur, Altman included, a lot of them did not necessarily go against him and kind of was like yes men. And because of that, you've got these guys coming across these, they hordes of Chinese Communist forces coming in and doing battle with them. These guys would come in with loud noises and like tambourines, or I'm not sure tambourines, but stuff that made noises as their battle cry instead of other ways. And so it was a different type of battle in that sense. And these guys a lot of them were just recruited in and kind of forced into these positions and stuff. And so the fighting was very brutal. And they would literally, this is going to sound horrible, but they'd stack up sometimes the Chinese and use them as to help, shoot the gun or whatever, because the bodies were so many bodies that they had to do this so they could fight. And that was part of, so the weather, like I said, it was very much a huge part of that battle and put the battle in a different light. We have guys that, like I said, that were severely wounded, that the blood stopped flowing because of, the cold. And so they were able to do stuff. And we had commanders that stood up, even though they were wounded, and maybe with a crane or whatever, or stick, or whatever, and kept encouraging their guys to go on, and leaders. And so there's that trust that was there between the Marines and their officers that is very special and unique, that they knew that they could trust each other and they believed in each other, and they did. And they worked hard. And it was hard to have those foxholes like you might see in a war movie, because the environment was so harsh. to have that. And so they need to build stuff up sometimes for a low spot. So hitting the ground was definitely a part of their strategy at times, just to keep low.
Definitely. And it would be remiss not to include another major thing that all battles need, and that is, of course, logistics and supply lines.
Right.
So, what role did logistics and supply lines play in the success and hardships faced by the Marines of the Chosin Reservoir? And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also another famous Marine Corps legend that also emerged at the Chosin Reservoir. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a different battle, but that is the story of Sergeant Reckless.
Yes. Sergeant Reckless was not at Chosin Reservoir, but she is a great example of a good Marine. So logistics for the Marines, that's one thing that O.P. Smith really was concerned about with his guys. He wanted to make sure his guys had the supplies that they needed and the whole 9 yards. So what he did is he actually built the airstrip up, and I think it's Hung he or me. I might be saying it wrong. But anyhow, he made sure there's an airstrip built. So he actually had the airstrip built just so he could make sure his guys got supplies brought in. Because the mountains are rugged and everything like that. Some spots you might not be able to get cars very well. So they had to be able to do things. So some of the way they brought stuff in was actually through helicopters. They'd have them, for example, when they went through the Tonkin Pass to get the guys out, they actually had to bring in some bridge head pieces and stuff, make like a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And so the helicopter was very much a part of the success. In that sense, they brought him in stuff. It also allowed him to evacuate people when they got to a certain spot and everything. So that was really important, logistics speaking, and it allowed them to bring in, supplies or weapons or food or whatever they needed to. And so that was a big thing. Where the army, not the army, but Belleau would, they would have had like supply wagons or something like that might be following them behind, but might not be able to get through the battle, depending where it's at or whatever, and have access to, which is something, logistics is something that kind of a struggle at different times for the Marines. And I'm sure the Army too, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah, logistics and supply lines are very key to any battle to survive, because you can have almost all the best equipment in the world, but if you don't have very good supply lines or good logistics of how to deliver said supplies, whether by land, sea, or air, your units are absolutely going to be decimated and overrun. And now, comparing both Belleau and the Chosin Reservoir, what can be said about the adaptability of the Marine Corps strategy in those different environmental conditions and warfare contexts? Because World War I, it was the beginning of, the modernized warfare era. And the Chosin Reservoir, as you could say, it's the modern warfare of the day and age, just a little bit more heightened in, different area, different, fighting force.
Right.
And ultimately, again, similar weapons. It's right after the war in the Pacific, maybe 5 years or so, and still being in that mindset of, okay, I have to be ready for war. I have to be ready for battle.
Right. Well, thing is, both times, really, the U.S. military has not been prepared. I will say that. It's probably a recurring theme we have a lot in this country, because we have a separate independent military, so to speak. I mean, it's, part of our government, so to speak. But because it's a volunteer, it's something that happens a lot. And because we have so many people that are anti-military, I think at times they don't understand their significance or their importance and all. Our military is one of the first things that gets gutted. And so that's something they both probably had in common. Right after World War I, after the Civil War, which was, 50 years, quite a ways away, they still had downsized and stuff. And the Navy was the big thing they thought of at that point. So for the Army and the Navy, the Marines, that would not been like a lot of support. And I think as they got closer to World War I, they started increasing things. So the Marines were the smallest branch. So they were also like the redheaded stepdaughter of the Navy. So they didn't always get the best stuff right away. And so that was something that really was big thing with Belleau. With Chosin, the Reservoir, it was 5 years away, but they had got away a lot of the old stuff. And so we had a lot of guys that are using older equipment, and, they might not work at first or whatever, especially in the colder weather and all that. That kind of was part of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir that they had to deal with. They didn't necessarily have the most accurate or quick equipment, but they had stuff that was left over maybe from World War II. And they also had something that both of them were like modern age wars. Like you said, World War One was the first modern world with the new technology after the Industrial Revolution. Well, this was Chosin Reservoir and just the Korean War in general was the first war after atomic bombs. And so it was kind of like, is this going to be used or not? That's all those things that were part of the war strategy. What we do, what do we not do? How do we keep Russia out of the war? And for the Korean War, like, okay, so we don't want to do this, we don't want to do that, and kind of rules, engagements that kind of, not necessarily handicapped them to the same degree, I don't think, as other ones, just because this point they had already turned the table, so to speak. It seemed like until the Battle of Chosin, it seemed like the U.S. was winning, and so was the United Nations because we were representing, representatives. But the Chosin Reservoir kind of changed the tenure of the war, so to speak. We went from, being very victorious to, yes, we had a great escape and a great breakout and everything, but it's still the kind of war would drudge on from there. It's like the second phase of the war kind of started at that point. And then Sergeant Reckless, she was later on, like in the war, and she was logistics. Like speaking, she carried her recoilless rifles up and down, to the guys, and then she would bring the wounded down. So she was incredible. Sergeant Reckless was really incredible.
Absolutely. Another story that not a lot of people may know about, the Marines. And there's also another famous character in Marine lore, and that is, what's the Marine's name? But it was a duck. It was a duck during the Pacific that was adopted by the Marines and became the first, they didn't know at the time, the first female Marine to join an amphibious landing in the Pacific, which I thought was very, very funny and very, very cool. And on the topic of amphibious warfare and amphibious landings, in your opinion, Lynn, how did the Marine operations in both World War I and the Korean War contribute to the development of the modern amphibious warfare tactics that we use in today's military?
Everything can trace back to the Marine Corps, basically. The Army, the Navy, everything. If you go back and look at manuals, they use the Marines manuals first as their step. So it was a stepping stone for everybody. The Marines recognized during World War I, there was the Battle of Gallipoli, and that's when people decided that amphibious operations couldn't work. It's just like, done. We're done. Modern war is too much. We can't do this. And then so you have the Marines coming in and saying, wait a minute here. We can make this work. They studied it. They did this. Major Pete Ellis, he's the one who wrote amphibious the plans, basically, pretty much the plan was used for World War II, the island hopping campaign. It's pretty much based on what he wrote. He's the one who had the theories and everything. And Lejeune, they were World War I. They were both World War I, working in that battle. They weren't at the Battle of Belleau as soldiers or Marines at all. They were observers or doing something else at that time period. But both of them influenced. And then also there's several other Marines besides those two that part of that corps that worked on building up this amphibious doctrine through the tentative landing manual, the landing doctrine. They're the ones who worked the amphibious tracks, LVTs that we have. And even now, today, the model is still based on that LVTA that they use for war, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. They changed the name of it, but it still kind of has that basic framework from the LVTA, which is landing vehicle tracked, and then they had armor. Then the A1, they put armor on it. So all that comes back to that. And like I said, today, the Marine Commandant General Eric Smith, he recognizes the amphibious operations as part of who the Marines are, and that's why they keep doing amphibious operation practices here and there. One thing with amphibious operations is we can go anywhere. Either by boat, helicopter, airplane, they can go anywhere. There's pretty much nowhere they can't go because we're 80% water and, you can fly. So they're very good at being America's first reactionary force, which they've been doing since, I don't even know how long. It's been a really long time. And all. Since before World War I, they've been doing, they're America's reactionary force type of thing.
Fascinating. And again, I love that we're talking about these two very important battles because, again, you don't hear a lot of these. You don't hear a lot of the Battle of Belleau or the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir
Mhm.
as, topics of study to look at the Marines. And we've name dropped quite a few Marine leaders
Mhm.
and figures in the Corps, Jesse Puller being one of them. Now, on the topic of leadership, what are some specific qualities and decisions from Marine commanders during the Battle of Belleau Woods and the Trojan Reservoir that had lasting influence on future military engagements going into, you could say, then World War II and then into the Cold War and post-Cold War?
Uh-huh. Um, I think there's several names that would pop up that have influenced things that were either they were in Belleau or they were part of this force or helped develop the amphibious operations that have influenced till today. One of them is Holland Smith. There's like three Smiths that I can think of off the top of my head that all had important roles either in World War One or World War Two that definitely carried over into World War Two and chosen more of a Korean War. And even now I think some of the stuff they did because they wrote doctrines and stuff like that that influenced the course to this day. Holland M. Smith, he actually is the guy who helped train the army guys for amphibious operations. So the first groups that were trained in army by the army were under him. And so he has that
Ah,
role in that sense. And he's kind of probably not acknowledged a lot in that area, but I mean he does have a reputation in the Corps. And so he in that sense, he was very much that. Um, Julian Smith, he's another one that I would say he again because he was there for the battle. Well, he was there for Tarawa and he was there for other war battles, and he would have been around during World War I also. So he's another one that was been around during that time period, and he was one of the guys who, when people were saying that amphibious operations should still be dead because of after the Battle of Tarawa, he stuck up for it. He believed in it so much
mm,
to what it should be done and everything. And he's one of the ones that was there. It was like Julian Smith and Helen Smith were both part of the Battle of Tarawa, the very first one. Um, and so, oh my goodness, I just saw something. He was at that one. He was also at the Battle of Peleliu, which was the First Marine Division's first strongly opposed amphibious operation. Interesting. Sorry, I'm making connections here. Anyhow, so he another one that really, in that sense, made influence. And O.P. Smith, he definitely did. He's a guy that, like, some people had trouble with Chesty Puller type of thing, and he saw Chesty Puller who Chesty Puller was, and so he was kind of this person who can kind of entwine the two groups together type of thing. So, because Chesty Puller was always for his Marines, enlisted Marines, he loved them to death. He would do anything he could for them. Every time he lost one that took a part of him, he was just this awesome, awesome guy. And to this day, he's still being taught about in the Corps. They everybody knows who Chesty Puller is. If you don't know who he is, you're probably not a Marine. That type of thing. But he didn't always necessarily get along necessarily with other officers because he would put his Marines before the officers, and they didn't necessarily like that. But O.P. Smith knew that he'd be good at this or whatever, and he knew how to kind of pull back a little bit or whatever. So he kind of helped modify Chesty a little bit type of thing. And I think that's good. He was able to, and they had a friendship and everything. And so again, these are guys that help influence the Corps. General Lemuel Shepard, another guy who really influenced the Corps and how the directions and stuff like that. And he became a Marine Commandant. So those are just a few. There's probably a lot more than that, but just who've been at both. Cates was a general, became a Marine Commandant. He also influence things, So a lot of these guys that became Marine commandants, they would put their handprint on the Corps, as they shaped it or whatever. And a lot of them kept shaping it towards the amphibious situation or whatever. But John Lejeune should be considered the father of amphibious operations because of World War I and Belleau Wood, and because he saw the Corps' future and what they needed to do to be an effective military organization. And he took steps right away convincing the American people about amphibious operations. Like he would have his Marines reenact Civil War battle, for example, Gettysburg. And they would do it the old way, and then they would do it the amphibious way. So he kind of started trying to win the people over for that. So again, he's definitely, his influence is majorly over the Corps, as well as Legion's, of course. And so that's just a few. There's just so many. It's kind of hard to say them all.
You are correct, Lynn. You are absolutely correct. And going back to what you were just talking about before, about the Marine trying to convince the American public, I'm actually going to combine
Uh-huh.
two questions together because I definitely think they fit really well. And that is, in your opinion, how did the courage and tenacity displayed by the Marines in both conflicts influence the morale and motivation of the Allied forces, as well as alter public perception and support for the military back home in both instances?
Okay. For Belleau Wood, I- what they did there, and they became household names, and so they made it where people were willing to support the military in the whole 9 yards and line up for it and all. They pretty much took volunteers through almost through the whole war. I think eventually I think World War II is when they had to start taking some people that weren't necessarily volunteers, but they had volunteers because people that first to fight moniker, they were seeing it. That was their moniker before World War One. We're first to fight, always off to go, and they were. They went all over the place. The Banana Wars, think of those. That's where they developed their close air support. That's where they developed a lot of their close tactics that they use. Is those
Mm-hmm.
battles and everything. And so yeah, and then you have so that kind of takes for the Belleau aspect and how that influences everything. And in the Chosin Reservoir, that battle, I don't know if they were respected and everything, but I don't think people had a true understanding of the significance of that battle
Mm-hmm.
because it was in the midst of all these other battles going on and stuff like that. And it's the battle that people might thought, oh, they lost. And they didn't lose. They just had to leave, come
A
back
tactical
another day.
retreat.
Yes, the tactical retreat, exactly what it was. And that's what the Marines thought about it. Was they called it a tactical retreat? They didn't say we were losing the battle. It was a tactical retreat. We had to regroup, which is what part of war is. That's part of what you do. You retreat. Those tactical retreats, and then you go again. And that's kind of the Marine set mentality. Like if we don't get it today, we'll go back and try again. Type of thing until we get it. And so I think the Chosin Reservoir didn't necessarily. People were already tired of war before the Korean War, so I think the Korean War kind of got overlooked big time. People didn't understand its significance in the whole picture and how really the Korean War is part two of World War II, so to speak, because this stuff started happening during World War II where the Russians joined the war, American effort and everything, and said, "Yeah, we'll help out." And then they moved into North Korea. It took over that area, and like, oh no, they're taking over the area. We need to stop it. So we have Americans on the other side of this border that was made by Americans arbitrarily, this line, whatever. And then so that's why I'm calling it kind of part two, of World War II, because it's kind of interrelated to all that, those dynamics that were happening from that war. And then you have the Korean War. Also, you had people like Truman who had fought in World War One, by the way. And I know he's not Marine and he's kind of anti-Marine, but I'm bringing him up for this point is that because of his experience at World War One, it colored his thinking with the Battle of Korean War too, so to speak, because he didn't want the guys on the ground fighting like that and everything. So he was more restrained with his battle plans than maybe he would have been if he hadn't been through what he had been through. That colored his whole thinking, which of course affected the Marines. And he didn't like the Marines, and one of the ones that wanted to downsize them until they did this stuff, and it kind of made him go, "Ooh, I better keep my Marines." But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so it was just, that's why I said I think it was just like everyone's tired of war by then. They had 4.5 years of war, and they didn't, appreciate it. And like Truman, the part of his thinking at that point was he didn't want another nation falling into communism, and so that domino effect, which about, I'm sure, that was something that shaped his thinking with this. And we have to go in, and so, but he didn't want a total war because he didn't want Russia back in the war and go to another World War. And so that kind of restrained what he did and let them do and everything too. And
Yes.
MacArthur, on the other hand, was like, let's go, let's go, let's go. And he's trying to restrain MacArthur. And, you have O.P. Smith going, wait a minute, you can't spread the guys out like this. It's just going to put them in danger. So you have all these things going on with this battle and the Korean War period with this mentality type of thing until he actually they fire MacArthur,
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. I'm
but yeah,
100% correct, Lynn, about, the legacy of the Marines and ultimately,
yeah,
public perception of them at two different points because, as you mentioned earlier, when the Marines were, given their glory in World War I, I mean, they're hailed as
Yeah,
heroes, and of course, the Army didn't like that. But when you go
right,
into the Korean War, it's sad to say, but it also is very, very true, unfortunately, is that Korea will always be remembered as the forgotten war. Not a lot of people know
right,
about it. It was just like a little footnote saying, yes, it happened, but
right.
no one really explores anything about it or gives it the history that it's due. And I think to end this incredible discussion, Lynn, here is the final question I would like to ask you. How did the legacy and bravery and sacrifice of the Marines at both Belleau Wood and the Chosin Reservoir shape the values and traditions of the Marine Corps that in the decade followed?
I I think those battles have impacted the Corps, and they always will, because these were times where they had to stand up and make a difference, and they knew that, and that brotherhood they had for each other. I don't know. I know with my dad, even now, like if they said, "Hey, go to war for us for the Marines," he'd hop on a bus and go. He'd be the first one there. He'd be like, "Yeah, I'm going. I'll go take care of my Marines," and that's just kind of how it is. And people don't understand when they say once a Marine, always a Marine, but it's because
Mm-hmm.
this this training that they start out with, they make these men and women, these Marines, and they know they have each other, they trust each other, they go through these horrific events, which even they have like a crucible thing they do now, where they have to go through this crucible, and it's a training exercise, and it helps them to learn their strengths and weaknesses, and they pull it together and analyze them. But they always tell each other, we don't leave the Marines behind. So they know that. They go to war knowing that we don't leave Marines behind. No matter what, I got your back. And I think that shaped the Corps during the Belleau Wood. It made it so the Marines kept fighting. It shaped the Marines as they were trying to prepare for the next battle, the next war. It shaped them even now in like how the thinking is now. So it definitely that ethos of being something. And I know I've seen like comments from like an army guy, like looking at research on their amphibious operations, and he observed a Marine Corps landing and everything, and he was just like blown away by these guys and saying, "Hey, we need to listen to these guys and have them help us out with amphibious operations because they know what they're doing and it's really good." And the more training you have with this, the better you have. And Marines are super good at training and training and training and training and training and training over something like amphibious operations. I mean, I've ran into people in stores and they see my military, my school, military university stuff, and they ask me, they'll tell me, "Oh, we did those amphibious flex exercises," and this is like you know, 100 years later or whatever. I'm hearing people
Yep.
mention that amphibious exercise concept is still part of who the Corps is today, to this day. And even though we have been in more land battles the last 50 years than other battles, it still is amphibious force, and it always will be because of the Battle of Belleau Wood and because of Chosin Reservoir as moments that sit in their history, in their lore, and in their Marine Corps song. It's important to them to be there and do that and do all that. And the Marines, they always will be. Simple as that.
Well said, Lynn. Well said. And on that note, everyone, we conclude another amazing episode of the Historians Lounge series here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to my good friend Lynn for coming back on the show. Lynn, always a pleasure having you back. Now, just to reiterate for our viewers, especially our new subscribers, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out and connect, as well as check out any articles that you may have already published or in the works?
LinkedIn is a good spot to go. I have a LinkedIn account. I guess I need to move to other ones. I haven't done anything with that yet. LinkedIn is a good spot to find me. You can find me. I think it's Lynne Marx. If not, it's just Lynne Marx. But I'm on there. You will look down. You can see my stuff. I will try to be. If you follow me, you will see that I'm working on certain things at times because I post that, and then some of my book reviews will be up there also. So I'm always doing things on there off and on, depending on where I'm at, my research or whatever. So yeah. So thanks a lot for having me. As always, it's a pleasure.
Absolutely, Lynn. I will link all that down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to see Lynn's other appearances on the channel, I will also link them up here for you to watch. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode here on the channel. Again, a huge thank you to my friend Lynn for coming back on the show. Wishing her the very best with her articles and upcoming publications. And if you'd like to see her back on the show in a follow-up historians interview and possibly in a roundtable style episode, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody, and we'll see you all next time. Take care. Bye-bye.